Can we begin? And can you just confirm when I'm hooked up to Michael, and I'll start the meeting formally. Okay, Michael. Good morning and welcome to the Referendum Bill Committee and our third meeting in this year. Our first item on the agenda this morning is a witness from who's the Clerk of the States of the Assembly in Jersey, Michael Gallagher. If I've got this title right, Michael, the Griefer of the States.
It's Greffier, as we say.
Sorry.
Yes.
It's a great name. Got to see. I think we'll start calling the clerks in the Scottish Parliament Greffiers from now on as well. I like that. Welcome to the proceedings of the Referendum Bill Committee. I'm very grateful for you taking part in this session with us. It will help us understand a lot more of the challenges we face here in Scotland as we bring in the franchise bill for the introduction of voting at 16 and 17-year-olds for the referendum in the autumn of 2014. So I'm very grateful that you're here. I'd just like to start off with a very general question, Michael, if you don't mind. Just if you could explain your role in relation to electoral administration and provide us with a brief overview of the process of lowering the voting age, and then I'll open up to general questions. I think that would be a nice way to start us off. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think I should say, Committee, that I don't have any direct role in the electoral registration process, but as Clerk of the Assembly, I sort of have a central role in seeing the various authorities that go on and how the franchise works. I work with the political committee that's responsible for the public elections law. We lowered our voting age to 16, as I think you've seen from your briefing papers, in 2007. It was done not as a result of a particular Government of Jersey initiative or anything of that sort. It was brought by an individual private member of our Assembly who happened at the time also to be Assistant Minister for Education, but she did bring it more in her own private capacity. She brought it to the Assembly for debate, and members did take a political stance on it. As you know, we have a system, perhaps you've read in your papers, of independent members largely in Jersey. We're not based on political parties as your own party would be largely. And the members of the Assembly took their own political stance on it. Perhaps the nearest parallel I could think of recently to help you understand that sort of process would be perhaps the recent vote in the UK House of Commons on the gay marriage issue was it this week or last week, where individual MPs simply took their own political stance on the issue, and that was really the case here with lowering the voting age, and there was a fairly narrow majority in favour of doing that, and we made the change for the 2008 elections as a result.
And what were the main sort of process challenges you faced once the decision was made? I
don't think anybody, looking back, felt that there were any major challenges. Voting registration in Jersey, as I think is still the case, reading the evidence you had last week, although I know you're having an imminent possible change in the United Kingdom, but voting registration here is still done largely on a household basis, where a form is sent annually to each household, although it is the duty of each eligible voter in that household to fill the form in and sign it. What happens, the form comes pre-completed with the names who are already known to be on the register, and it's the duty of people in the household to check they're still entitled to vote, and obviously if you're on it you're likely to still be able to register. If there are new people who've reached the age of 16 or people who've left, obviously you make the changes and you send that form back. So I think in practice, with many 16 and 17-year-olds, as probably would be the case in Scotland, they're living at home with their parents, and so one assumes that a responsible adult, possibly often a parent, may take the initiative to say, we need to put little Johnny or Sarah on the form because they've now reached the age of 16, you'd better fill it in. So I don't think we faced any real practical challenges. Individuals are also able, of their own volition, to seek to register separately at any time. If they've missed the annual trawl through the household list, they can apply to their relevant parish. The electoral register is done by our 12 administrative parishes who each do their own area, and anybody can go along. And registration closes shortly before the election, some 3 to 4 weeks before the election. There's no annual cut-off date. It's simply related to an election or a referendum. Our referendum law gives a 21-day period.
That's very
for
useful.
the closure of the...
Thank you. It's a very useful overview, Michael. I'm going to now turn to Annabel Goldie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Dillehay. Can I just ascertain specifically when the law was changed? I know it was changed in 2007, but when in 2007?
You may know the process of passing primary legislation in Jersey is that it must go for formal sanction by Her Majesty in Council, the Privy Council. So the legislation was adopted by our Assembly in September 2007. There was the in-principle decision on the proposition brought by the member I mentioned in July that year. The change to the law was a very, very simple one-line change. It simply changed the number 18 to 16. That was passed by the Assembly in September 2007, but after the Privy Council process, it came into force on the 1st of April 2008. And our elections were then held in October of that year. So there was a 6-month gap, effectively, between the change and the elections.
And you've anticipated my second question, so I'm very grateful.
Sorry.
No, that is helpful. Now, I know the electorate in Jersey is somewhere around 82,000, or approximately that level it was in, I think, 2011. And I'm just interested in the detail of the process. You had 6 months to effectively ascertain who was eligible now to become a voter for the 2008 election. And you've mentioned that you work on the basis of household registration. Is that correct? So
that is correct, yes. What I think, fortunately, the April cut-off date was before that year's annual trawl to the household. So I think the forms that would have gone out in 2008 would have encouraged people in the households to say you can now include anybody in your household who may not have been eligible before but is now meets the registration criteria.
Right. And can I ascertain, had you been on an individual voter registration system, would that have increased the administrative work?
Yes, as you say, it's a slightly hypothetical question because we didn't have to think about it, but I suppose the answer could be possibly it might have done. I don't know how. I did read the evidence you had last week about the move to individual registration. It does seem that your electoral authorities have some quite wide-ranging statutory powers to go into schools and get... I was surprised they could get access, for example, to school rolls and university lists and these sort of things. I'm not sure in Jersey we'd have to probably change our law to give us that power. There is a sort of hybrid, I think. It's not... under our law, it's not the duty of the head of the household, for example, to complete the form. I'm not sure the position in the United Kingdom. The form goes to a household address. It is under the law the duty of each individual eligible voter to actually fill that in. That does obviously require some cooperation between the people living in the household. And I suppose there could be occasions when a head of a household might not show it to somebody, or perhaps when I say a household, it may not be a traditional family. It may just be some people who live together in a house who... and there's no particular reason they would want to pass the form around. That could be a failing in our system, I suppose.
So just for my last question, between April of 2008 and the election in 2008, the Electoral Registration Office had a basic trawl of household canvasses of people who could vote, and then you tried to identify the attainers, the 16-year-olds or whoever, on the back of that.
I think that's right. Yes, that's right. Yes. What we don't have is any sort of, I'm not sure if it does happen in the United Kingdom, is any sort of reconciliation between who you think you should have and who you've got. There's not really any way of verifying that. I mean, I did notice, for example, if I assume under what I was reading, the evidence you had last week, if you had a list of people at a particular university or school, you'd think, well, we should have them on the list. Have we got them? We don't have that sort of reconciliation process. It is really just doing all you can to get as many people as you can. We estimated we reached somewhere in the 2011 elections at about 80% of eligible people. I think the UK national average is somewhere at 82%. I think from what I read, your Scottish average, you appear to do slightly better, I think, from the assessors who spoke to you last week.
Thank you very much indeed.
Tavish, do you want to comment? No. Okay. Rob.
Good morning. We noticed that there were somewhere in the region of about 2,000 names added to the register of 16, 17-year-olds. As a percentage of the total, that's fairly small. Was there a difficulty in doing so? I heard you discuss, is it 12 parishes or so that sort of deal with this? It would be a fairly small amount of work, I guess, in terms of their overall job to make sure the register was up to date.
Yes, there is some political pressure in Jersey for the parishes to do more, actually. So the largest parish, St Helier, where I'm talking to you from, the capital of Jersey, has about a third of the population. They do a lot of proactive work with electoral officers who actually go out and knock on doors and say, we don't seem to have a form from you. There is some feeling that some of the smaller parishes are perhaps not doing quite enough to. Perhaps the feeling is if people want to register, it's their duty to do so. They should come and do it. Should we be going knocking on doors? So I think you may be right. That more could have been done. But I think we probably, our perception is as a percentage of the overall voting population, the registration levels in the lower age group is probably as good as the general average. I don't think it's better or worse particularly.
But overall, it would mean that the people who are doing the registration didn't have a huge extra amount of work.
Oh no, I don't think so, because as I said, because of the way the forms went out, most households may have had Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the past, and they simply had to add a young 16 to 17-year-old, as they would have had to do in the past if one of their children had passed the age of 18. So,
thank you very much.
James Kelly is going to ask the next question, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning to you, Michael. You've outlined that in terms of data capture, it's pretty much a manual exercise in terms of you've got your officers, you send out the mail-in, and you obviously have some follow-up with officers going around canvassing households, reminding them, to get registered. In terms of attempting to get 16 and 17-year-olds onto the register, what was have you any feeling for what was the percentage success rate?
I think, as alluded to in my last answers, I think our perception is it probably reached about the general level across the population, which we think for the tooth that we did a big push. Also, we've had a second set of elections with voting at 16 in 2011. We did a big push on registration and managed across the island to add 2,000 or 3,000 people to the register. And I think our perception is that the percentage of the 16 to 18-year-olds is probably 16 to 17-year-olds is probably about the same as across the population as a whole. I don't think it's greater or less than the average across the population.
And are there any additional data capture measures under consideration in terms of being able to improve your success rate, not just with 16 and 17-year-olds, but across the whole population? Not only to get more people registered, but to address the issue you highlighted earlier about the lack of a reconciliation between the register and potential people who have not signed up.
Yes, there is something fairly major on the horizon, because Jersey is about to set up a population database effectively for monitoring, obviously, immigration, and the size of the population is a big issue here in the island because of the pressure on space and accommodation. And we are setting up a database. The government of Jersey is setting up a database of the population, and there have been discussions recently by the committee of our Assembly that looks at electoral matters with the government to see if in due course there may be options of data sharing to actually access that database, and that would be possibly a very accurate way if one could pin down the residency eligibility criteria for voting from that database. Having said that, one of your questions I know touched on data protection. One of your possible questions raised the data protection issue, and the Data Protection Commissioner in Jersey does have some concerns about allowing that population database to be used for a public register, which at election time is made available to candidates and others, and obviously does then become a public document, and she did have some concerns about that, so that would have to be addressed in any data sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think this fits quite closely with some of the stuff that Patrick wanted to ask, and it would build on it. So Patrick Harvey will be next, Michael.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'm interested in the issues around the public awareness and the promotion of this change. I see from the proposal that we've got from the deputy who was promoting the change in the first place that there was a trawl of some schools and to begin discussions with young people about this potential change. But when it was going through during the trawl, the forms going out after the change was made and before the election, were there other efforts made to raise awareness among 16 and 17-year-olds, not only in order to get them to register, but to promote voting as well? And is there a difference in the body that has a responsibility to promote registration as opposed to promote participation in the election?
Yeah, largely that work falls to what's called the Privileges and Procedures Committee that effectively does both of those jobs, raises awareness of registration and then raises awareness of voting. I think looking back, it's fair to say with hindsight that 2008 perhaps we didn't do enough to raise awareness. I suppose the change was quite recent and there was a feeling that perhaps we went into those elections having just changed the voting age without quite knowing whether young people of that age would or wouldn't be interested in registering and voting, and I don't think enough was done. So more effort was made for the 2011 elections. There was a bigger voter registration and voting campaign. It was effectively a two-stage campaign, so you had the cut-off date for registration, so the campaign initially led up to that and reminded people only 5 days to go to register. Have you got your form in? There were social media sites, there was a website, there was media advertising. Then after the cut-off date for the registration, now you're registered, now go out and vote. There was, as I imagine there will be in Scotland, some political and general pressure to ensure that efforts were made to try to reach the 16 and 17-year-olds. Clearly things like Facebook and Twitter were used, and I suppose although they may appeal more widely, there was an expectation they would appeal particularly to the younger voters. We did commission a YouTube video. There's a character in who's done some very irreverent and humorous YouTube videos about Jersey and poking fun at politicians and poking fun at life in Jersey. We took a slight risk. We thought initially we weren't sure that politicians would be happy to sign him up for the voter campaign, but they were very good sports about it. He did a very irreverent and amusing but actually factually based YouTube video about get out and register and what's the point of voting, etc. I can send you the link if you'd like it on the big screen.
We'll all be looking it up as soon as we get back to our desks. Maybe we'll have to recruit Lemmy for the campaign in Scotland. I'm just wondering about the level of success that was achieved as well. We've got a graph here in front of us in the briefing that shows not very dissimilar line between low 33% turnout among 16 to 34-year-olds rising to a 79% turnout in the higher age group. Are you able to say what the turnout is among 16 and 17-year-olds, the group specifically this change refers to, and is there ongoing work to try and increase that for future elections?
There is no empirical data on the voter. We don't record age of voting. I think there would be issues of voter secrecy to trawl through registers and identify, who had. So all the evidence we have is anecdotal. Having said that, I think it's fairly robust anecdotal data. I spoke yesterday afternoon in advance of this evidence to one of the most senior returning officers who's handled elections for many years, who's very experienced, and her view was what was widely said in the island, that actually, unfortunately, the level of turnout of this age group had been very, very low. She said we saw virtually no people who looked to me 16 and 17. There were some who came with their parents, but I feel the general message is, unfortunately, we didn't reach the age group. That's not to say, it would be quite wrong for me to sit here and say to you, as a result, it was a failure. If you read I read through the Hansard of the debate about this issue, and of course some people were saying it's not about quantity necessarily, There are some of this age group who are very politically engaged. We should be doing all we can to get as many people as we can in Jersey interested in politics, even if only 10% turned out, as I think was the evidence at that time and in the first Isle of Man election. That's at least 10% we wouldn't have had before. So that's a matter, I think, for political judgment. Certainly I could find as many politicians in Jersey who would say to you that it's been a failure as I could who say to you it's been a success. But certainly, unfortunately, I can't say to you there was a massive enthusiasm and turnout. That certainly wasn't the case. I think it's probably true to say that young people may find generally, although with some very notable exceptions, the political process something they find difficult to engage with, particularly with our system of independent politicians. Even many adults struggle to know exactly what candidates stand for, what their policies are. Sometimes people are well known, sometimes they're not, and those sort of judgments are made. Existing politicians get judged on their record. So for a 16 or 17-year-old, it could be difficult to know, why would I want to go out and vote for these people? I don't really know who they are. Most of them look a lot older than me. I don't really understand what they're going to do for Jersey. Obviously, the parallel with your own situation is very different, I think, without in any way ever dreading to touch on Scottish politics. But it's clear to me, looking from outside, you have a one-issue referendum. The issue is very clear, and I would assume that even young people have views on that, so they won't have that same difficulty that people have here in Jersey of saying, how do I choose 3 members to vote for from this long list of 50 and 60-year-olds who I don't really know and never met and don't know what they stand for?
Something we can all empathise with, I think, from time to time. Thank you, Convener.
Now, Linda, was yours a supplementary, or was it want to go to another area? Because otherwise I would bring in Stuart Maxwell. Stuart Maxwell and then Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Delahey. I wanted to just follow on from the questions that Patrick Harvey was just asking, and you were explaining some of the difficulties you had with young people. But I wondered, were there any particular practical difficulties? For example, 16 and 17-year-olds coming to polling stations and being ignorant of the process or not knowing what to do, or is there any evidence that they were put off by the process itself? Because a lot of the arguments of those who are opposed to the change say that those people who are under 18 are immature, unaware, ignorant of the process and what's going on, and so we shouldn't lower the voting age. I wonder if you found any practical difficulties.
No, I'm not aware of any. I wasn't told of any. I think it's difficult to answer your question, isn't it? Because it's the part of your question saying were they put off by the process? Because, as I've just said to Mr. Harvey, the turnout was not high, so therefore one could argue perhaps they were put off by the process. The fact they didn't come was perhaps because they found the process off-putting. I don't know. There's no evidence whether that's the case or whether they just didn't come because they weren't interested. Those that did come, I think, were not confused or put off by the process because they would, I think, by definition, be those who are very politically alert, very politically aware, and therefore would clearly find no difficulty at all. I mean, one of the strong arguments made at the time of the change, if you read the Hansard and read the proposition brought by the member, was, of course, that one assumes that those who oppose it possibly assume that at 18 people suddenly magically become politically aware and become aware of the process, and actually there are plenty of 16-year-olds probably who are just as aware of that as there are 18-year-olds who aren't. And so I don't think anybody was put off by the process at that age, but it may well be that they just found the process something a lot just didn't wish to engage with or didn't find something they were vaguely interested in or relevant to their lives.
Just one small supplementary. Yes, it's very, very quickly one. Thank you, Convener. I just wondered if there's any work done on the views of 16 and 17-year-olds about the proposition to lowering the voting age. Obviously, there was a debate amongst politicians and others who are clearly over 18, but was there any work done to assess the views of 16 and 17-year-olds?
There was, taking the member who brought the matter to the Assembly for debate. As I say, she was at the time, coincidentally, also an assistant minister in the Education Ministry. She didn't actually wear that hat when she brought it, so it wasn't an Education Minister matter directly, but she obviously was wearing that hat, and she had gone to visit schools, and she did talk to the young people, and she did canvass opinion, and in her own assessment there was quite a strong support for the change. But as I say, that didn't necessarily translate into those same young people, when being given the opportunity, actually going out and doing it.
Thank you.
I'm anxious that we get to child protection issues. But Stuart McMillan, if you could ask a short question in your area, then I want to get to the child protection areas before I wipe this session up. So Stuart McMillan's next, Michael.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr Delahey. Just something you said earlier on in your evidence, I'm just seeking a wee bit of clarification on, please. When you highlighted the point earlier regarding the 16 and 17-year-olds going on the register, but the 16-year-olds in particular, at what point would you actually undertake to get them onto the register? Is it when they turn 16, or is it when they are still 15 to get them on?
No, our position... Yes, I understand the question.
Yeah, the reason for posing it is earlier on you said that it's when someone turns 16, that's when they would actually go onto the register.
That's right. Our law is different, I understand, to the law in the United Kingdom, because you have to actually be 16 before you can apply to register. We don't have any form of pre-registration, so a 15-year-old coming up to a particular date cannot register in advance. The law says that when you are to apply for registration, you must be 16 or over, so you can't actually even apply in advance. So there's no... that is something that our subcommittee, looking at the review of the law, is looking at to see if we should be able to capture people who actually will be 16 by the given date. At the moment, you have to be... No one goes on the register until they're at least 16 or over.
One final question, and just on that. Excuse me. With that being the case, how many people, when it comes to an actual election, what is the estimated number of people, of 16-year-olds, who would actually be disenfranchised because they weren't actually on the register in time up until the closing date for them to actually apply? What actually has been kind of the number of individuals up to now?
I don't have I haven't actually looked at the actual statistic, but it would be fairly... it should theoretically be fairly small because, as I say, we don't have, like, for example, an annual cut-off date, so it's not 1st of December, 1st of August. The registration remains open until effectively the eve of the nomination day for the election, which is usually about three to 4 weeks before the election. So there are unfortunately a small group who will be 16, turn 16 in that 3-week period, and I imagine some of those would feel, if they were politically active, particularly aggrieved because they will be actually 16 on voting day. It is something, as I say, that the subcommittee looking at our law is aware of, and I think will make some recommendations on that. Effectively, if you give the vote to 16-year-olds, it only seems fair they should be able to vote if they're 16 on the day of the election. I don't know what the Scottish position is on where the cut-off date would be for any referendum. Obviously, there would be a cut-off date, I assume. I don't know where that would be. It's something that I'm sure you'll be looking at.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to come to Linda Fabiani, and then I'll come to Tavish Scott following that.
Yeah, just a very quick question on that last point, Michael. Can you tell me whether that decision was taken due to any concerns about data protection?
No. I was, when your clerk kindly sent me some possible areas of questioning, and the one area that jumped out at me that I wasn't expecting, I have to confess, was the issue of data protection. I sort of thought, where is the committee coming from on data protection? I think something that may be a big difference in Jersey, that maybe addresses some of the concerns you may have, is that we don't have any system of selling or allowing our register to be used for other purposes. It is purely an electoral roll. I know, for example, in Scotland and in the United Kingdom, the register can be used, for example, for credit rating agencies. Myself, yesterday evening, preparing for this meeting, just looked out of interest on the internet, and you can find peopletracer.co.uk where you pay some money and you can access the electoral register. We don't have that sort of system. We've been very firm in Jersey. We had a lot of pressure from the UK's largest credit rating agency, who actually sent some of their chief executives to meet our committee a couple of years ago, saying you're really prejudicing people in Jersey because they're not allowed to access your register and they won't be able to get credit cards. In practice, we have a system where people can apply to their parish and simply have a certification they're on the register. And so the fact the register is therefore not used in that way, I think, lessens greatly the data protection issues. Our commissioner does, I spoke to our data protection commissioner, she does have slight concerns that a public copy of the register is made available in the public library. It doesn't have dates of birth on it, but it has names and addresses. I think if she had her way, she'd like to see the law changed so that all that personal information isn't sitting in the public library. But it's not electronically, it's not on a website anywhere, so I suppose that does lessen some of the data protection concerns.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think that leaves us with Tavish Scott, who's got a question about schools, I think, Tavish.
Good morning. I wondered if I could ask about the promotion of voting for 16-olds and older in relation to charges of political indoctrination. Did you have any concern, or not you personally, but did parents, did school teachers, well, maybe you did personally, but did parents, school teachers and others have any concerns about the politicians imposing not the voting on this age group, but their political views? And how did you address, if those concerns existed, how did you address them?
There was a very strong message that came out from our Education Ministry that they would not have politicians going into schools individually to talk to groups of sixth formers, or they did feel that was not right. There were one or two events organised by schools on a very sort of fair, objective basis where all the candidates came and had a sort of youth hustings, but there was some of the candidates felt slightly aggrieved that they felt the schools were being overprotective. They would not allow people to go in and organise meetings, etc. But the Education Ministry was quite firm. They thought that would be inappropriate, and that probably addressed some of the issues that you're raising.
No, thank you. And did that reflect, did the Education Ministry reflect parental concerns? I mean, was there, an active number of letters to local newspapers and television interviews about that, or was the problem not really as great as might have been envisaged?
No, I don't recall any large groundswell of any concern. The main pressure came from the Education Ministry, who said, look, we're not having candidates coming into schools. That's not the answer is they can't come, and for the 2011 election, that was the 2008, it was very, 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 very firm. For the 2011 elections, I think they did concede there may be some event at which everybody was invited on that sort of impartial basis. All the candidates were there, and a bit like a sort of youth hustings, effectively, like you may have a public meeting for a normal election.
Therefore, and I'll finish with this question, Convener, but therefore, how were politicians able to make their case that this new young age group in Jersey, are now able to vote and participate in these elections if they couldn't access, I understand the arguments you're making, but they couldn't access schools, which is, after all, where most young people would be?
Well, I think the candidates simply had to use the other methods that were available across the population, by having public meetings in which they would invite everybody to come, so including the younger voters if they were interested. Most candidates these days, I'm sure is the case in your jurisdiction, will have websites and send out leaflets. There were supplements that went out to households with candidate manifestos in. So I think it's an interesting question that you will no doubt grapple with as well, the extent to which one concentrates. I think there's always pressure to concentrate on this particular age group, because if you lower the voting age, it seems a logical consequence that you must therefore do something more to concentrate on this group. And I know there are some people in Jersey who have expressed the view that it's as important to concentrate on everybody and get voter turnout across the piece, and one shouldn't concentrate too much effort. I think my colleague from Guernsey, who's going to speak to you afterwards, recounted to me that he had some of this pressure, and as a result he had to turn up for an old people's home to press registration there, so he was shown not just to be concentrating his efforts on the younger age group.
To bounds. That's the basic premise that the evidence you're giving us today.
Sorry, I missed the
basically schools were out of bounds to politicians in that respect. Yeah.
Schools were out of bounds except on a very organised, objective, impartial. Yes, certainly candidates could not come into schools one at a time and talk to people in groups. No, much as many wanted to and felt felt it was very wrong, they couldn't do that.
Thank you.
One last question, I think, from Annabel Ewing. We'll have to press on then, because we'll...
Morning, Mr Delahey. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned at the outset that there had been a narrow margin in favour when this legislation was passed in Jersey. And I just wonder, some 5 years on, is there any significant clamouring to repeal this legislation and to go back to putting the voting age back to 18 from the lower age of 16?
No, I think one thing I felt like should, I think, say to you was that I think this change would be seen very much as a one-way street, or whatever one describes it. One cannot imagine, although there are some people in Jersey and some politicians who remain opposed to it and will say to you, it was a total waste of time, why did we do that, I was always against it. I don't think there's ever any suggestion that one could go back. I think it would be inconceivable to go back. Because one thing that does strike me, looking in purely as an outsider, of course, is the anomaly you may have in Scotland between different voting ages for different elections, and I'm sure that's something you'll be looking at as the franchise bill comes through, that people may be able to vote in the referendum and then be not able to vote in the following UK parliamentary election, for example, unless you're pressurising your Westminster colleagues to do some work there as well.
Thank you. Well, those sadly are matters out with our control at the moment. But
okay. Michael, thank you very much for your contribution. It's been very helpful giving us an overview of what's going on in your own particular jurisdiction. And I hope you enjoy the rest of winter in your warmer climes down there.
Thank you very much, Committee. It's been a very clear link. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now suspend this particular part of the meeting until we start the next session. Thank you very much. Reconvene the meeting. Can I just confirm that Paul Whitfield can hear us okay?
Yes, I can, Convener, yes.
Okay, Paul, then in that case I'll do a very quick introduction just for the record. And thank you for tuning into our proceedings today and giving evidence to the Referendum Bill Committee. We have with us today Paul Whitfield, who is the Deputy Register General of Electors and the electoral roll in the States of Guernsey. So welcome, sir, to our proceedings, and we're grateful to have you here. I'd just like to open up with a very general question about if you could explain your own role in regard to electoral administration in Guernsey and provide a brief overview of the process of lowering the voting age in your jurisdiction, and then I'll open it up to questions. And the first question I'll take will be from Annabel Goldie. So
sure, that's fine.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, well, in Guernsey, my role as Deputy Register General of Electors is one of two hats I have to wear, normally being Chief Officer of the Home Department, but we have a responsibility for covering the registration part of the election process. And certainly, and the most recent election, which was 2012, we put a significant effort into engaging with the younger voter in this process and had quite a degree of success. I think you have quite a bit of background information into our structure, but just to remind you that we do not have a party political system. We have 7 parochial electoral districts, and all candidates would then stand for 47 independent seats within our government, being known as the States of Deliberation. In 1972, the age was lowered from 20 to 18, and indeed, like Jersey, following the pathway of other Crown dependencies, there was a move pre the 2008 election to lower the voting age to 16. Indeed, the timelines for that were very short. This was raised not by an individual member, but actually our parliamentary committee of that time, which was called the House Committee, took a report to the States Deliberation to lower the age to 16. That report was cleared in the States in the December for the elections, which were April of 2008. So you can see that the actual electoral roll itself was closed in the January, so there was a very short time window for that particular election in order to engage and motivate the younger people to vote. But indeed, effort was made to do that by providing, obviously, a reasonably extensive awareness campaign. Towards the end of the process of getting people to register, registration slips are sent to each household. Familiar to Jersey, that households are targeted rather than individuals, and the registration slips then contained the approval in law for the younger people to engage with the process.
Very short time scale, but in terms of that short time scale, what significant or insignificant legislative change was actually required?
The legislative change was part of the Reform Guernsey Law of 1948, and that was amended to provide the reduction of the age from 18 to 16. That had to go past through our states, and as I say, it was a very short time frame, but was approved in the December prior to the 2008 election itself.
Just a one-word sort of change in your legislation, or was there more substantial change to the actual law?
No, it wasn't a substantial. It was an amendment, but it wasn't a particularly difficult change to make.
Okay, thank you very much. Annabel Goldie.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Mr Whitfield. Did you indicate that you work on the basis of household registration, not individual voter registration?
We do, yes. Right. Households are targeted with forms. We also have online registration in the island.
Okay. And can I also clarify, we gathered from the evidence given from Mr Dillehay in Jersey that you actually have to be 16 before you go on the roll. What is the position in Guernsey?
The position in Guernsey, we also allow our 15-year-olds to pre-register to make sure that we capture everybody that can possibly vote who is 16 at the time of the election.
Okay, that's very helpful. Now, am I correct in saying in 2012 your electorate was about 29,500 individuals on the roll?
That's correct, yes.
And this very tight timescale, because you changed the law in December, your roll closed in January and then you had an election in April 2008. Were there practical challenges in addressing that?
I think there was considerable challenges at the time. I'm not sure, given the evidence base that we've got, the degree of success at the time, although that young people did engage and vote. And as I previously said, there was an awareness campaign once the government report had gone through and the legislation was put in place in terms of the amendment. And indeed, we do a confirmation slip to all households, a registration slip that again confirms to those in the household who has successfully been placed on the register. So that slip was revised to contain further encouragement in the time window that was left for young people to engage in the process. Of course, for the most recent election, which was 2012, a considerable campaign was done in Guernsey to engage specifically with young people.
Finally, reverting to the 2008 election, I mean, I'm not a mathematical genius, as my colleagues will confirm, but presumably with that very tight timescale, the element of 15-year-olds would be small, because you would have a roll going out in closing in January. So,
yes, it would have been at that particular time, yes.
Right, okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Paul, I'm just going to introduce some people who you can't see because they're sitting behind you in the chamber who've just arrived. But I'd kind of welcome some members of the Serbian National Assembly, the delegations led by Zoran Babic, the committee chairman and president of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and the Serbia Advisory Board. There's 2 deputy speakers from the Serbian National Assembly, Ms. Gordana Komic and Ms. Vesna Kovac, I hope I've got these names right, are also in attendance, so welcome. And with that short break in proceedings, Paul, I'll now turn to James Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr Whitfield. A couple of points. First of all, bearing in mind there's no legal requirement, as I understand it, to include the date of birth on the registration form. What is to stop, ahead of an election, what's to stop a 15-year-old registering who will only be 15 at the time of the election, but getting on the register and still voting when they're not yet 16?
Obviously, there is quite good checks in place at the time of registrating in terms of also placing the vote. Quite good information is put out in our awareness camp about fraudulent behaviour in terms of the registration process and electoral roll. There is a degree of trust element put in it in terms of this bailiwick, but we haven't seen any significant abuse of the electoral roll.
Okay. You said that there were some good checks in place, so is there anything, that for 16 and 17-year-olds that would check, for example, against, school or university rolls?
No, we do not use the school or education rolls at all in Guernsey in terms of the electoral roll.
Okay, and following on from that then, just generally in terms of, data capture, the process as I understand it is that you send a letter out to the households, which is a slip that the households have to fill out. Are there any alternative methods of identifying either people in the general population or 16 and 17-year-olds who potentially should be on the register or could be on the register but have not applied?
That's a difficult question to answer. We obviously, in terms of encouragement, we do engage heavily with the colleges and the high schools in the island. But in terms of making a check against those that could be potentially on the list, we have obviously an estimated number of young people available for us. So, for example, for the 2012 election, that was 1,270 potentially within that age group that would be captured, hopefully, for engaging with that election.
Thank you. And I'm very keen that, Paul, we get some evidence on our record here about data protection issues and child protection issues, because we couldn't get any evidence really from our last evidence taking session from Michael Delahaye from Jersey. So, Linda, do you want to open up in that area? Linda Fabiani.
Hello, Paul. You said that you allow pre-registration for 15-year-olds, and of course we've heard that there can voluntarily be a note of date of birth placed on that. Were there any data protection issues discussed at the time and concerns expressed, and have any come up since?
Indeed, obviously, that was a consideration, and we did talk to the Data Protection Commissioner, which incidentally, we do have some arrangements where we work closely with Jersey, and we do, in fact, share the same Data Protection Commissioner as a Pan-Island Commissioner. It wasn't perceived to be a problem, simply because it is not a requirement to put the age on the household registration slip. And also, as our colleagues in Jersey, on the electoral roll itself, the date of birth is not recorded. Again, we don't use the electoral roll from Guernsey for any other purpose. And although publicly available, the age groups are not identified within the registry or the roll itself.
Thank you.
Okay. Patrick, I think you had questions to do with general publicity and schools, etc. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You mentioned in passing to one of my colleagues the awareness campaign that took place. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, obviously, during the political debate about whether to make the change, there have been some level of public awareness. But in the months that followed, up till the election, what activities took place, not only to promote registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, but also to promote participation in the election and other different bodies that have the responsibility for those different functions?
Sure. I think the starting point that politically is, of course, there are no party politics in Guernsey. So there is a consideration that individual politicians, because they're looking for independent seats, it will be possibly inappropriate for them to sort of go around schools in a more uncontrolled way to engage with them about, obviously, personally engaging with them and their mandate to vote. However, given the structure that we've got and the responsibility under my role and the department, we put an extensive campaign to engage with our education department and how we would encourage young people to be stimulated by the process. Obviously, within the curriculum, they do their citizen awareness programmes, and part of that is the political awareness. And so, therefore, we joined up with that process and visited all the high schools and all the colleges on the island. We put on presentations and talked about obviously the history of voting, why it's valuable to our society, very democratic style of government being the 47 independent seats, and why it's important not only for now but the future for them and the island. So it was really kind of stimulating people to do that. Then what was the process? We talked about how you could register, how you could go online to register. We also used Facebook to try and provide attractive means for people, also a website for young people, so they could find ongoing information about how the campaign, if you like, of awareness was developing and how they could engage with that. We were delighted about the take-up of young people. Indeed, when looking, although some of the statistical information in Guernsey is quite difficult to get for various reasons. One, because of the date of birth isn't on the roll itself. But it was interesting when you looked at the engagement that quite often there were young people in households where the older generations, possibly the parents, were not actually registering, but the young people in fact did. And we do put that down to the extensive campaign we did to engage with young people.
And are you able to tell us anything about the participation in the election of newly registered 16 and 17-year-olds? A colleague from Guernsey was not able to break that down and give us a turnout statistic for that age group. Are you able to do that?
Sure. Whilst it is difficult because, again, we don't make it compulsory for the date of birth, over 600 young people did record their date of birth, and so therefore we worked it out on the age group potential that over 50% in fact did register. 156 pre-registered, so those are the 15-year-olds, and they went on to vote at the time of the election. So quite a positive result and outcome as far as we were concerned.
Thank you very much.
Now, Rob, is it you're in the same area? If not, I'll bring in Annabelle for a supplementary.
The collection of the data, I think, is interesting. You've got 7 districts, I understand, Paul. Do they all take a part in this, or is there a centralised system of collection of the data?
Two things happen, really. Obviously, there's 7 electoral districts, but the information in terms of the electoral roll is then collated centrally.
OK, there's no need to go further on that. Thank you, Convener.
Whitfield, it's just a wee technical issue following in the child protection line of questioning. Because you have a household registration basis for electoral registration, and because you do include 15-year-old attainers, is there any provision for keeping the address of a 15-year-old undisclosed for the purposes of the final register?
I think if I understand that question, obviously the household, the information comes in, but on the roll, again, we don't envisage that as being a problem because although the occupants are then transferred on to the electoral roll, their ages aren't shown. So unless those people were familiar to you, you wouldn't know what age they were.
But if a 15-year-old, for example, were the subject of a non-disclosure order about address because of previous difficulties in the family, would there be any way in which that 15-year-old who wants to vote could have their address withheld? They're just put on as an eligible voter.
I'm not sure if I've got the answer to that one, but I can certainly come back to you if that would be useful.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Annabelle. Stuart Maxwell.
Can I just follow up one question, following Patrick Harvey's earlier questions? You said candidates were not allowed to go into schools for perfectly obvious reasons, but was written material from candidates allowed to be distributed in schools to 16 and 17-year-olds?
Indeed, the mandates of all the independent candidates were made widely available, including schools. And I know that some schools did, in fact, do mock elections themselves and did a form of registration and voting within schools. Also, some of our politicians did go into schools in order to encourage the purpose of the election process, but not to actually sell individual mandate and interest in themselves. That was obviously to encourage the electoral process.
Thank you. I presume that process was relatively strictly controlled, given the necessity for political balance and not allowing one particular side or one particular candidate being allowed to access 16 and 17-year-olds and others not.
That's absolutely right, and we work very closely with the Education Department in terms of how we introduce anybody who wished to politically engage, if you like, with pupils or students. So that was done purely on an awareness of and importance of the election process, not indeed about individual politicians.
Okay, just one final question. Were the views of young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, and perhaps 15-year-olds, canvassed in advance of the change in the voting age to see what their opinion was about the lowering of the voting age? And secondly, did you come across any practical difficulties in the actual process itself of young people voting in the polling stations, or did they find it as equally easy or difficult as any other members of the population?
Yeah, certainly just to answer the first part of the question, the original, before the 2008 election, the House Committee did in fact distribute quite widely a questionnaire to households and young people. And it was recorded that 56% wanted the age of voting to be reduced, and 54% said it was reduced, they would certainly go on to vote in that election in 2008. In terms of the process, it wasn't perceived that there was any particular difficulty in terms of the young people. Again, there was quite a lot of information that we put up on our website at the time explaining, and we encouraged that through Facebook, to kind of take out the fear factor and maybe some perception that it was quite a boring thing to do and disinteresting. We tried to demonstrate how, in fact, it was very simple and how much added value that they would bring by taking part in the process.
Thank you, Stuart. I was asked the questions I was very much going to ask.
Okay, wider canvas. Anybody else want to come in with any other questions? Okay, well, can I thank our very kind witness, Paul Whitfield, from the state of Guernsey, for coming and joining us this morning. I'm very grateful to you, sir, for giving us your evidence. It's been very helpful and giving us a broader overview of some of the challenges we may or may not face here in Scotland. So thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your winter in Guernsey. I'm glad you're not here, for your sake.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for asking.
And that's my phone gone off, and I do apologise. Just 2 seconds, I forgot. I think that's probably quite appropriate that I should reprimand myself severely for allowing that to happen, given that I said we should switch them off at the beginning. That being said, I think that now brings us to the conclusion of the witness session taken. The next meeting is scheduled for the 21st of February. At that meeting, we'll continue the pre-stage 1 oral evidence on the franchise bill, and we'll hear from Stephen Carse, electoral registration officer at Isle of Man, by video conference, and from Gordon Blair, a returning officer from West Lothian. There will also be an item on the paper to consider the approach on the franchise bill, including agreeing potential witnesses and a call for written evidence. With that, can I thank you all for your attendance this morning. Thank you very much. And can we close the meeting at this stage? Thank you very much.